The Charleston air hung thick and humid on that September morning in 1859, the kind of heat that made breathing feel like swallowing cotton. But it wasn't the weather that made Grace's hands tremble as she stood on the auction block in Ryan's Mart. It was the eyes. Hundreds of them, staring, judging, appraising her like livestock. Grace Montgomery was 23 years old, though she looked younger. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany, her eyes a startling green, a gift from a grandfather she'd never known, a ship captain from distant shores. Those eyes had always made her different. Special, her mother had said. Cursed, the overseers whispered. Today, they made her valuable. Lot 47, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the courtyard. Prime female, healthy, strong hands, can read and write. Yes, gentlemen, you heard that right. Educated by her previous owner's daughter, perfect for house service. Grace kept her chin up, though every instinct screamed to look away. Her mother had taught her that much before fever took her 3 winters ago. Let them see strength, baby girl. Never let them see you break. The bidding started at $800. Within minutes, it climbed to $1,500. Grace watched the faces in the crowd. Plantation owners in fine suits, merchants calculating profit margins. One man stood apart from the rest, tall, silver-haired, with eyes like chips of ice. He didn't bid. He simply watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. 2,000, someone shouted. 2,500. The auctioneer's grin widened with each call. Grace was the prize of the day, and everyone knew it. But what they didn't know, what no one in that courtyard could possibly know, was the truth she carried. Grace Montgomery could read and write, yes, but she could do far more than that. She could remember. Every word, every document, every secret conversation she'd overheard while serving tea in drawing rooms and carrying laundry through hallways where powerful men spoke freely, believing a slave girl was deaf to their schemes. For 3 years, Grace had been collecting information. Names, dates, ships that arrived in dead of night, cargo that was never recorded in official ledgers, money that changed hands beneath tables. She knew which Charleston gentlemen were smuggling illegal goods from Cuba, which ones were selling weapons to those who would use them against the United States itself. And she knew something else. Something that could bring the entire corrupt system crashing down if she could just survive long enough to tell it. $3,000. The bid came from a heavy man with sweat stains darkening his collar. But then the silver-haired man raised one finger. $5,000. The courtyard fell silent. $5,000 was a fortune, more than most men earned in 5 years. The auctioneer stammered, looking between the silver-haired man and the other bidders, waiting for a counter that never came. Sold to Mr. Edmund Carver for $5,000. Grace's heart stopped. She knew that name. Edmund Carver owned the largest plantation in South Carolina, Whitmore Estate, 40 miles north of Charleston. But he was also something else, something the polite society of Charleston whispered about in scandalized tones. A man who collected beautiful slaves the way other men collected fine art, and those slaves, people said, often disappeared, sold south to places where questions weren't asked, or worse. As the shackles were removed from her wrists, temporary courtesy for such an expensive purchase, Grace made herself breathe, made herself think. She'd been sold before, twice. The first time when she was 10, after the master who owned her family died and his debts were settled. The second time, at 17, when her mistress discovered Grace could read and became frightened of what that meant. But this time was different. This time, Grace had a plan. 6 months ago, she'd managed to get a letter out, smuggled it with a traveling preacher who took pity on her. The letter was addressed to a man named Samuel Foster, a free black man in Philadelphia who worked with something called the Underground Railroad. Grace had heard about it from other slaves, whispered stories of a secret network that helped people escape to freedom. In her letter, Grace had offered something valuable: information, evidence of crimes that would interest the federal authorities, names of traitors who were already planning for war, stockpiling weapons, making alliances with foreign powers. She'd promised to deliver it all if someone could get her out. She'd never received a reply, never knew if the letter reached its destination, but she'd held on to hope anyway because hope was all she had. Now, as Edmund Carver's men loaded her into a wagon bound for Whitmore Estate, Grace looked back at Charleston one last time. The church spires reaching toward heaven, the harbor where ships bobbed in the water, the city that had been built on the backs of people who looked like her. "Move along now," one of the men said, not unkindly. He was young, maybe 18, with sun-weathered skin and uncertain eyes. "Mr. Carver don't like to be kept waiting." The wagon lurched forward. Grace closed her eyes and thought of her mother, thought of the stories she used to tell about their ancestors, warriors and queens from a land across the ocean. "Their blood runs in your veins," her mother had whispered. "Remember that when the world tries to make you small." Grace wasn't small. And what she knew, what she carried in her perfect, crystalline memory, was powerful enough to shake the foundations of Charleston society. But first, she had to survive Edmund Carver. The wagon rolled north, leaving the city behind. The road grew rougher, winding through pine forests and past rice fields where slaves worked in water up to their knees. Grace watched them, and they watched her, this girl in a clean dress being transported like precious cargo to the most feared plantation in the state. As the sun began to set, Whitmore Estate came into view. It was beautiful in the way nightmares sometimes are. A massive white mansion with columns that seemed to hold up the sky itself, gardens that sprawled in geometric perfection, and behind it all, the slave quarters, rows of small cabins that looked like dollhouses from a distance but housed the broken dreams of hundreds. The wagon stopped at the main house. Edmund Carver stood on the veranda, waiting. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and aristocratic, with the bearing of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. "Welcome to Whitmore, Grace," he said, and his voice was smooth as poisoned honey. "I've been looking for someone like you for a very long time." Grace met his eyes and saw something that made her blood run cold. Recognition. He knew, somehow he knew she was different, knew she was dangerous. And he'd bought her anyway. As she was led into the house, Grace realized the truth with terrible clarity. This wasn't a plantation. It was a prison, and Edmund Carver wasn't just a master. He was a collector of secrets. And he just added her to his collection. The room they gave Grace was nothing like she expected. It wasn't a bare cabin with a straw mattress and dirt floor. It was a proper bedroom, small but furnished with a real bed, a washstand, and even a window with glass panes and curtains. The kind of room a house servant might have, not a field hand. That should have been a comfort. Instead, it terrified her. "Mr. Carver wants you rested," said the woman who'd escorted her upstairs. Her name was Dinah, and she was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that gave nothing away. "You'll start your duties tomorrow. He'll send for you when he's ready." Grace watched Dinah leave, heard the key turn in the lock. A locked door, a comfortable room, special treatment. All of it wrong. She went to the window and looked out over the estate. Even in the fading light, she could see the scope of it. Hundreds of acres, dozens of buildings, and somewhere out there the people who worked this land, who suffered under Edmund Carver's rule. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself feel the weight of her situation for just one moment. She was alone, trapped, and the man who owned her knew something. She was certain of it now. But she couldn't afford to break, not yet. She sat on the bed and closed her eyes, retreating into the palace of her memory. It was a technique her mother had taught her when she was small, back when memorizing Bible verses was the only education a slave child could hope for. Grace's memory was different, though. Perfect. Eidetic, a traveling doctor, had called it once, before her master sent him away for talking to the slaves. She could remember every page of every ledger she'd ever glimpsed, every conversation she'd overheard, every face, every name, every detail. In her mind, she walked through the rooms of her previous master's house in Charleston, the study where he'd met with other gentlemen late at night, the desk where documents were left carelessly open, the conversations that happened over brandy and cigars while Grace stood silent in the corner, invisible to men who believed slaves couldn't understand their schemes. She remembered it all. The ship manifests showing cargo that didn't match the official records, the letters discussing weapons purchases from European sources, the maps showing meeting points along the coast, the names, the names of everyone involved. Senators, judges, wealthy merchants, military officers. All of them conspiring, all of them preparing for a war they believed was inevitable, a war that would tear the country apart and let them reshape it in their image. And Grace had memorized every piece of evidence. The key turned in the lock. Grace opened her eyes as the door swung inward, but it wasn't Dinah returning. It was Edmund Carver. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lamps, studying her with those cold, calculating eyes. In his hand, he held a leather-bound book. "You're wondering why I bought you," he said. "It wasn't a question. You're wondering what I want." Grace said nothing. Her mother's voice whispered in her memory, "Let them talk. Powerful men love the sound of their own voices." Carver stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Grace's pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. "I know what you are, Grace Montgomery," he said softly. "I know what you can do." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't move. Carver set the book on the small table beside her bed. "I've been searching for someone like you for 3 years, someone with your particular gift. Do you know why?" Grace finally spoke, keeping her voice steady. "No, sir." "Because knowledge is power," Carver said, beginning to pace the small room like a professor giving a lecture. "And the ability to remember perfectly, to recall every detail without error, that's not just knowledge, that's a weapon." He stopped and turned to face her fully. "I know you worked in the Ashford household. I know Thomas Ashford hosted meetings of the Charleston Committee. I know you were there, serving tea, carrying trays, standing in corners where men spoke freely." His smile was thin and sharp. "And I know you remember every word." Grace felt ice spreading through her veins. He knew everything. "Mr. Ashford died 6 months ago," Carver continued. "Heart failure, they said, but his papers, the important ones, they were already gone. Burned, most likely, by someone who knew what they contained and wanted to protect the men named in them." He leaned against the wall, studying her like she was a puzzle to be solved. "But you don't need papers, do you, Grace? You have it all locked away in that remarkable mind of yours. Every name, every date, every transaction." Grace's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Don't lie to me." His voice hardened. "I paid $5,000 for you, not because you're beautiful, though you are, not because you can read and write, though that's useful. I bought you because you're a library, a walking, breathing archive of secrets that men would kill to protect." He pushed off from the wall and moved closer. Grace forced herself not to flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," Carver said. "You're going to tell me everything you know, every name, every detail. You're going to help me build a case so airtight that the federal authorities will have no choice but to act. And in exchange, I'm going to give you something you want very badly." "What?" Grace whispered. "Your freedom." The word hung in the air between them like a promise and a trap all at once. Grace stared at him, trying to understand. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm not what you think I am," Carver said quietly. Yes, I own slaves. Yes, I run a plantation, but I'm also something else. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather wallet. Inside was a badge. A federal badge. My name is Edmund Carver, and I'm an agent of the United States government, he said. I've been working undercover in Charleston for 4 years, documenting a conspiracy to commit treason. These men are planning to start a war, Grace. They're stockpiling weapons, making alliances with foreign powers, and they're going to tear this nation apart if someone doesn't stop them. Grace's mind raced. Could this be real? Could he be telling the truth? Why should I believe you? She asked. Because 6 months ago, a letter arrived at the Philadelphia office of a known abolitionist named Samuel Foster, Carver said. A letter from a slave girl offering to trade information for freedom. That letter was forwarded to federal authorities. To me. Grace's breath caught. I've been looking for you ever since, Carver continued. And when I heard about the auction, about a slave girl who could read and write, who'd worked in the Ashford household, I knew it had to be you. He pulled a chair over and sat down, meeting her eyes at the same level. I know you're scared. I know you have no reason to trust me. But Grace, I need what you know. The country needs it. And I swear to you, on my honor as an officer of the United States, that if you help me, I will personally ensure your freedom and your safe passage to the North. Grace looked at this man who claimed to be her salvation. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. But she'd learned long ago that trust was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. How do I know you won't just take what I know and kill me? She asked bluntly. Carver didn't flinch at the question. You don't. You have to make a choice based on incomplete information, just like I did when I spent $5,000 of federal money on the chance that you were the person I'd been searching for. He stood and moved back toward the door. Think about it tonight. Tomorrow I'll show you proof of who I am, documentation, correspondence with my superiors in Washington, and then you'll decide whether to help me or not. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. But Grace, understand this. Whether you help me or not, those men are still out there, still planning, still conspiring, and when war comes, and it will come, thousands of people are going to die. Soldiers, civilians, people who look like you caught in the crossfire. He opened the door. You have information that could prevent some of that suffering. That could bring traitors to justice before they can act. The question is, are you brave enough to use it? He left, closing the door softly behind him. Grace sat in the gathering darkness, her mind spinning. Could she trust him? Could she dare to hope that this might be the answer to her desperate prayer? Or was this just another trap, more sophisticated than most, but a trap nonetheless? She thought of her mother, thought of the slaves in the quarters outside, thought of all the people who'd suffered and died in this system of cruelty and injustice. And she thought of the information locked in her perfect memory, information that could expose corruption at the highest levels, that could bring powerful men to their knees. Edmund Carver was right about one thing: knowledge was power. The question was, how would she use it? Grace lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. Tomorrow she would make her choice. Tomorrow everything would change. Morning came too quickly. Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of activity outside. Slaves moving to their work assignments, overseers shouting orders, the rhythmic clang of the plantation bell marking the start of another day. For them, nothing had changed. For Grace, everything was different. She dressed in the simple gray dress that had been left for her and waited. An hour passed, then another. Finally, around mid-morning, Dinah appeared at her door. "Mr. Carver wants to see you," she said, "in his study." Grace followed her through the house, paying attention to every detail. The layout, the exits, the other slaves moving quietly through their duties. If Carver was lying, if this was a trap, she needed to know how to escape. The study was on the second floor, overlooking the front gardens. It was a masculine room filled with leather-bound books, heavy furniture, and the smell of tobacco and old paper. Edmund Carver stood by the window, but he wasn't alone. A second man occupied one of the chairs, older, perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore civilian clothes, but there was something military in his posture. "Grace," Carver said, "this is Colonel Marcus Hughes of the United States Army. He's come from Washington specifically to meet you." The colonel stood and gave her a respectful nod, a gesture that shocked Grace more than anything else could have. White men didn't nod respectfully to slaves. "Miss Montgomery," he said, his voice gravelly with age, "Agent Carver has told me about your remarkable abilities and about what you witnessed in Charleston." Grace glanced at Carver, uncertain. "Show her," Carver said quietly. The colonel reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a folder. Inside were documents, official papers with government seals, correspondence on military letterhead, orders signed by the Secretary of War himself. "Edmund Carver has been working for Army intelligence for 4 years, the colonel explained. His mission: infiltrate the Charleston elite and document evidence of a conspiracy to commit treason against the United States. He's done exceptional work, but we need more than his testimony. We need hard evidence. Names, dates, transactions, the kind of detail that holds up in a court of law." He looked at Grace directly. "Agent Carver believes you possess that evidence, locked in your memory." Grace's hands trembled slightly. This was real. It was actually real. "Why should I help you?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "You represent a government that allows men to own people like me. That lets children be sold away from their mothers. That looks the other way while we're beaten and starved and worked to death." The colonel didn't look away from her challenging stare. "You're right," he said simply. "Our government is deeply flawed. It contains within it a monstrous evil, but it also contains the possibility of change, of justice, of becoming something better." He gestured to the documents. "The men you know about, the ones planning this conspiracy, they don't want change. They want to break away and build a new nation founded entirely on slavery. A place where people like you will never have hope of freedom, where the evil you've experienced will be enshrined as the highest law of the land." The colonel leaned forward. "But if we can stop them, if we can expose their treason and bring them to justice, we might prevent a war, or at least shorten it, save lives. And in the chaos of such a conflict, there will be opportunities for change, for freedom." Grace closed her eyes. She knew what he wasn't saying directly. War was coming regardless. The tensions between North and South had been building for decades. The question wasn't if, but when. And when it came, her people would be caught in the middle, as always. "If I help you," she said slowly, "I want more than just my freedom." Carver raised an eyebrow. "What do you want?" "I want protection for the people here, on this plantation, and I want a guarantee, in writing, that when this is over, I'll be taken north with papers that prove I'm free, legal papers that no slave catcher can challenge." "Done," the colonel said immediately. "You have my word, and you'll have it in writing before you tell us anything of substance." Grace looked between the two men. She'd spent her whole life reading people. It was how slaves survived, by understanding the moods and motivations of those with power over them. These men were telling the truth, or at least they believed they were. "All right," she said, "I'll help you." The relief on Carver's face was genuine. "Thank you, Grace." "But I have questions first," she continued. "Why me? Why not just raid the houses of these men and seize their documents?" "Because most of those documents are already destroyed," Carver explained. "After Thomas Ashford died, the others panicked. They burned papers, destroyed ledgers, covered their tracks. We have fragments, but nothing complete enough to build a case." "Until you," the colonel added. A witness with perfect recall who was present for their meetings, who saw the documents before they were destroyed. Grace nodded slowly, understanding. When do we start? Now, Carver said. He moved to his desk and pulled out a notebook and pen. Tell us everything, every meeting you witnessed, every document you saw, every name you heard mentioned. Leave nothing out. And so Grace began to talk. For 3 hours, she spoke steadily, reciting from memory the details of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Charleston society. She named senators who'd taken bribes from foreign governments, military officers who'd diverted weapons to private stockpiles, merchants who'd smuggled gold and supplies to support a future rebellion. The colonel and Carver scribbled furiously, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just listening in growing amazement. Grace described documents she'd glimpsed while cleaning Thomas Ashford's study, letters discussing secret meetings in Cuba with Spanish officials, shipping manifests showing illegal arms purchases from England and France, financial records detailing funds being diverted to build a war chest. She recited conversations word for word, discussions about timing, about which states would join the rebellion, about how to provoke the federal government into actions that would justify secession. They called it the Charleston Committee, Grace said. 12 men who met monthly. They believed they were invincible, untouchable, and they might have been if they'd remembered to be careful about who was in the room when they talked. As the hours passed, the magnitude of what Grace knew became clear. She wasn't just a witness. She was the keystone that could bring down an entire conspiracy. "This is extraordinary," the colonel said, shaking his head in wonder. "Miss Montgomery, you've done your country a tremendous service." "I haven't done it for my country," Grace said quietly. "I've done it because these men deserve to face justice, and because I want to be free." "You will be," Carver promised. "I swear it." But even as he spoke, a commotion erupted downstairs, voices raised in alarm, the sound of horses approaching at speed. Carver moved to the window and swore under his breath. "What is it?" the colonel asked. "Thomas Ashford's son," Carver said grimly. "Robert Ashford, and he's brought others with him." Grace felt her blood run cold. Robert Ashford. She knew that name, knew his face. He'd been at many of his father's meetings, learning the family business. And he'd always looked at Grace in a way that made her skin crawl. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow he knows I'm here." Carver turned from the window, his expression grim. "Grace, listen to me carefully. This house has a hidden room, a priest hole built during the colonial era. Dinah knows where it is. Colonel Hughes will take you there now. Stay hidden until I come for you. Do you understand?" "But—" Now, Carver's voice cracked like a whip. The colonel was already moving, pulling Grace toward the door. "Come with me, Miss Montgomery, quickly." As they hurried through the hallway, Grace heard Robert Ashford's voice booming from the front entrance. "I know she's here, Carver. The Montgomery girl. She belongs to me by rights. My father's estate should have passed to me, including his property." Grace's heart hammered. This wasn't about her being valuable. This was about Robert Ashford knowing what she'd witnessed in his father's house, and knowing she had to be silenced before she could tell anyone. The colonel pulled her into a bedroom and pressed on a section of the wall paneling. It swung inward, revealing a narrow space barely large enough for one person. "Get in," he ordered. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Grace squeezed into the cramped darkness. The panel swung shut, leaving her in absolute blackness. Through the wall she could hear raised voices, footsteps on the stairs, Robert Ashford demanding to search the house. And then Carver's voice, calm and commanding. "You have no authority here, Ashford. This is my property, and the girl is mine, purchased legally at public auction. She's a thief. She stole documents from my father's study." "Then produce evidence and file charges," Carver said. "But you won't, because we both know there were no documents to steal. Your father burned them before he died. Isn't that right?" A long, dangerous silence. "Get out of my house," Carver said quietly. "Now." More voices, arguments, threats. And then finally, the sound of horses riding away. Grace let out a shaking breath in the darkness. But she knew this wasn't over. Robert Ashford wouldn't give up. Men like him never did. They'd come back. And next time, they'd bring more than angry words. Grace spent 2 days and nights in hiding. The cramped priest hole became her entire world, a space so small she could barely stretch her legs. With only darkness and the muffled sounds of the house beyond, Dinah brought her food and water after nightfall, whispering updates through the panel. Robert Ashford had left, but he hadn't gone far. He'd taken up residence at a neighboring plantation, gathering allies. Men who understood what was at stake. Men who knew that if Grace testified about what she'd seen and heard, their entire conspiracy would unravel. "Agent Carver sent word to his superiors," Dinah whispered on the second night, "asking for military escort to take you north, but it'll be days before they can get here, maybe a week." "I can't stay in here for a week," Grace said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You'll stay as long as you need to," Dinah replied firmly. "These men, they'd kill you without a thought if they found you, and they'd kill anyone who tried to protect you." After Dinah left, Grace sat in the darkness and thought about courage. Her mother used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Grace had always admired that idea in theory. Now she was living it. On the third night, everything changed. Grace woke to the smell of smoke. At first she thought she was dreaming, but the acrid scent grew stronger, and through the wall panel she could hear shouting. The house was on fire. Grace pushed against the panel, but it didn't budge. From the other side she heard Dinah's voice, "Hold on, I'm getting you out." The panel swung open. Smoke billowed into the small space, making Grace cough and her eyes water. Dinah reached in and pulled her out into the bedroom, which was rapidly filling with gray smoke. "They're burning us out," Dinah said, her face grim. "A dozen men, maybe more, they've surrounded the house." Through the window, Grace could see torches in the darkness. Figures on horseback circling the building like wolves around cornered prey. "Where's Carver?" Grace gasped. "Out front trying to talk them down, but they're not listening. They want you, Grace. They're willing to burn down the whole plantation to get you." Grace's mind raced. If she stayed hidden, everyone in this house would die. Carver, Dinah, the other slaves who lived in the main house, all of them burned alive because of her. "I have to give myself up," she said. "No," Dinah grabbed her arm. "That's what they want. They'll kill you the moment they have you. And they'll kill everyone else if I don't show myself." The smoke was getting thicker. Below, Grace could hear the crackle of flames. The fire was spreading fast, too fast to be natural. They'd used accelerant, oil or spirits. This wasn't meant to be a warning. It was meant to be an execution. Grace moved to the window and looked down. The drop was 20 feet to the garden below. Survivable, maybe, if she landed right. But the men on horseback would see her immediately. "Unless—" "The back stairs," Grace said suddenly. "The ones the servants use, do they lead outside?" Dinah nodded. "To the kitchen yard, but Grace, if I can get to the woods, I can hide. Buy time for help to arrive. The woods are miles from here." Grace grabbed Dinah's shoulders. "Then I'll run for miles. I've done harder things, trust me." Dinah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Follow me." They ran through smoke-filled hallways, staying low, coughing and choking. The fire had started on the ground floor and was eating its way up the main staircase, but the servants' stairs were still clear. They burst out into the kitchen yard. The night air felt like ice after the heat of the burning house. Grace could hear shouting from the front, Carver's voice raised in fury, demanding the riders leave his property. Go, Dinah pushed her toward the tree line. Run and don't look back. Grace ran. She'd grown up in fields and forests back when she was young enough to play. She knew how to move quietly, how to use the darkness. Behind her, the mansion blazed like a torch against the night sky, lighting up the grounds. She heard someone shout, "There, someone's running." Hoofbeats coming fast. Grace pushed herself harder, her lungs burning. The tree line was 50 yards away, 40, 30. A shot rang out. The bullet tore through the air beside her head. 20 yards. Another shot, this one closer. 10 yards. She crashed into the woods just as a third shot splintered the tree beside her. Branches whipped her face and caught at her dress, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind her, she heard horses crashing through the undergrowth. Men calling to each other, coordinating their search. Grace ran deeper into the forest, praying for a miracle. And then she saw it, a rocky outcropping with a narrow crevice beneath. Barely large enough for her to squeeze into, but it would have to do. She wedged herself into the space, pulling dead leaves and branches over the entrance. Then she went perfectly still, controlling her ragged breathing, listening. The horses came closer, stopped. "She came this way," a voice said, Robert Ashford's voice. "I saw her go into the trees." "It's too dark," another man replied. "We'll never find her in there." "Then we wait for first light, post men at every trail. She has to come out eventually, and when she does." The threat hung unfinished in the air. Grace heard them setting up camp, making plans, confident that they had her trapped. And they were right. She was trapped, alone in the wilderness with no food, no supplies, no weapon, and come morning they'd find her. Unless she found a way out first. Grace closed her eyes and thought. She couldn't go back to the plantation. It was probably burned to the ground by now. She couldn't go to the main road. They'd be watching it. Her only option was to go deeper into the wilderness and try to circle around to another plantation, one where she might find help. But that was miles through unfamiliar territory, in the dark, with armed men hunting her. Still, it was the only chance she had. Grace waited until the voices grew quieter, until she heard snoring from the camp. Then, slowly, she eased herself out of the crevice and began to move. She traveled for hours, guided only by starlight through the canopy. Her feet bled. Her dress was torn. Branches cut her arms and face, but she kept moving. As dawn began to break, Grace heard something that made her heart leap. Dogs. They'd brought tracking dogs. She ran, crashed through undergrowth, no longer caring about stealth. Behind her, the baying grew louder, closer. And then she burst out of the trees, into the middle of a military camp. Grace stopped, gasping, staring at rows of white tents bearing the flag of the United States Army. Soldiers looked up from breakfast fires, startled by this wild-looking woman who'd appeared from the woods. And there, emerging from the largest tent, was Colonel Hughes. He took one look at her, bloody, torn, exhausted, and understood immediately. "Sergeant," he barked, "I want armed guards around this woman right now, and someone find Agent Carver, tell him we found her." As soldiers formed a protective circle around Grace, she finally let herself collapse. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground. "You're safe now, Miss Montgomery," the colonel said gently. "You're safe." Behind them, Robert Ashford and his men emerged from the woods. They stopped dead when they saw the military camp, saw the soldiers with their rifles, saw that their prey had escaped. "That woman is a runaway slave," Ashford shouted. "Property of my estate. I demand you turn her over." Colonel Hughes stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This woman is a federal witness in a case of high treason. She's under the protection of the United States Army. And if you or your men take one step closer, I'll have you arrested for interfering with a military investigation." Ashford's face went purple with rage, but he was smart enough to know he'd lost. For now, this isn't over, he snarled. You have no idea who you're protecting, what she knows, the people she could destroy. Oh, I know exactly what she knows, the colonel said calmly. And that's precisely why she's coming with me to Washington, where she'll testify before a federal court. As Ashford and his men retreated, Grace felt the last of her strength give out. She'd done it, survived, escaped. But the hardest part was still ahead. 2 months later, Grace Montgomery stood in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. She wore a simple but respectable dress, dark blue, high-necked, proper. The kind of dress a witness might wear, not a slave, because in this moment, in this place, she was neither slave nor free. She was the voice of truth. The courtroom was packed. Senators, journalists, members of the public who'd heard about this unprecedented case. And in the defendant's box sat 12 of Charleston's most prominent citizens, including Robert Ashford. All of them charged with conspiracy to commit treason against the United States. Grace had been in Washington for 6 weeks, working with military prosecutors to prepare the case. She'd spent countless hours reciting everything she remembered, every detail being carefully documented and verified against other evidence. Now it was time to speak those truths in public. The prosecutor, a stern man named James Morrison, approached the witness stand where Grace sat. "Miss Montgomery," he began, his voice formal but kind, "please tell the court about your experiences in the household of Thomas Ashford of Charleston, South Carolina." Grace took a breath and began to speak. For 3 hours she testified. She described the meetings she'd witnessed, the documents she'd seen, the conversations about secession, about war, about building a new nation founded on slavery. She named names, provided dates, recited exact quotes from conversations that had happened years ago. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her. How could a slave girl possibly remember such details? How could they trust the word of someone who was, by law, property? But Grace didn't falter. For every question she had an answer. For every challenge she provided more detail, more proof. And when Robert Ashford's attorney suggested she was lying for personal gain, Grace looked the man directly in the eye. "What gain?" she asked quietly. "I'm testifying against some of the most powerful men in the South. Do you think that makes me safer? Do you think there's anywhere I can hide if they're acquitted?" She paused. "I'm here because it's right. Because these men plotted to tear this nation apart, and because someone needs to speak for the people who can't speak for themselves." The courtroom was silent. On the 4th day of testimony, Grace finally stepped down from the witness stand. As she walked back to her seat, she passed Edmund Carver, who'd been waiting to testify next. He gave her a small nod of respect. She'd done her part, now it was up to the court. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Other witnesses testified, military experts, document analysts, colleagues of the defendants who'd turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. But everyone knew the case hinged on Grace. On whether 12 white jurors would believe the testimony of a black woman over the denials of powerful white men. The verdict came on a gray January morning. Guilty. All 12 defendants, guilty of conspiracy to commit treason. The courtroom erupted. Ashford's supporters shouted in outrage. Abolitionists cheered. Journalists rushed from the building to file their stories. Grace sat quietly in the gallery and watched as the men who'd hunted her, who tried to kill her, were led away in chains to await sentencing. Justice, real, tangible justice. It felt like a dream. After the courtroom cleared, Colonel Hughes found her in the hallway. He held a leather document case. "Miss Montgomery," he said formally, "as promised." He opened the case and removed several papers. Freedom papers. Legal documents signed by a federal judge declaring Grace Montgomery to be a free woman. Papers that would hold up in any court in the nation. But there was something else too, a banknote. Congress has authorized a reward for your service to the nation, the colonel explained. $500. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to help you start a new life, wherever you choose. Grace took the papers with trembling hands. Freedom, real freedom. Not just the absence of chains, but legal protection, official recognition of her humanity. "Thank you," she whispered. "No, Miss Montgomery, thank you." The colonel's voice was rough with emotion. "What you did took extraordinary courage. You saved lives. You exposed a conspiracy that could have started a war years earlier than it did. You made a difference." Grace folded the papers carefully and held them close to her chest. "What happens now to the defendants?" "They'll be sentenced within the month. Prison, certainly. Some may face execution for treason. Their assets will be seized, their reputations destroyed." He paused. "And the evidence you provided has given us leads to dozens of other conspirators. This isn't over, but you've helped us strike a major blow against those who would destroy this nation." Grace nodded. She felt strange, lighter somehow, but also unmoored. She'd spent 23 years being someone's property, having her every move controlled. Now she could go anywhere, be anyone. The question was, who did she want to be? "Agent Carver asked me to give you this," the colonel said, handing her a sealed envelope. "He's been reassigned to another investigation in Georgia, but he wanted you to know that Whitmore Estate has been sold. The proceeds went to compensate the slaves who'd been working there. Many of them are traveling north with the help of abolitionist organizations." Grace opened the envelope. Inside was a short note in Carver's precise handwriting. "Grace asterisk. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I wanted you to know that working with you has been the honor of my career. Your courage, your intelligence, and your moral clarity have inspired me to be better at what I do. Dinah sends her regards. She's traveling to Philadelphia with her daughter and grandchildren. She asked me to tell you that you're always welcome at their table. Whatever path you choose from here, I know you'll walk it with the same strength you showed these past months. With respect and admiration, Edmund Carver." Grace folded the note and tucked it into her pocket beside her freedom papers. 6 months later, Grace Montgomery stood in a one-room schoolhouse in Philadelphia. It wasn't much, just a rented space above a tailor's shop, with rough wooden benches and a chalkboard she'd purchased with her own money. But it was hers. And it was filling with children. "Miss Montgomery," a little girl raised her hand, "can you teach us to read like you?" Grace smiled. "That's exactly what I'm here to do." She'd chosen her path. She would teach, would pass on the gift her mother had given her, the knowledge that learning was power, that education could open doors that seemed permanently locked. During the day, she taught children, free black children who'd never had access to proper schooling. At night, she taught adults, former slaves who'd escaped to freedom and wanted to build new lives. And once a month, she wrote letters to government officials, to newspaper editors, to anyone who would listen. She wrote about what she'd seen, about the injustice of slavery, about the corruption of powerful men who valued profit over human dignity. Some of her letters were published, most were ignored. But Grace kept writing, kept teaching, kept speaking truth. Because she'd learned something in that courtroom in Washington, something powerful and liberating. Her voice mattered. Her story mattered. And no one, no master, no law, no powerful man, could ever take that away from her again. Years later, when the war finally came, the terrible, bloody conflict that tore the nation apart, Grace's testimony was remembered. The Charleston conspiracy trial became famous, a symbol of the corruption at the heart of the Confederate cause. And Grace herself became something unexpected, a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the power of one voice speaking truth against injustice. She never forgot where she'd come from, never forgot the auction block in Charleston, or the fear of those nights hiding from men who wanted her dead. But she also never let those memories define her. Because Grace Montgomery was more than the sum of her suffering. She was a teacher, a witness, a free woman. And her story, the impossible story of the most desired slave ever auctioned in Charleston, became a testament to the truth that no one could be silenced forever. That justice, though slow, was possible. And that freedom, once won, was worth any price.